She pulls away, and most men lose control. Not because she's gone, but because their mind starts racing, filling every silence with fear and assumptions. And in that moment, attraction doesn't die from distance. It dies from panic. Topic 1. The moment she starts pulling away. What's really happening? He notices it first in the small details. That good morning that used to come with energy now feels dry, almost automatic. Replies start taking a little longer, and at first it's not even obvious, but something in the air feels different. And at this point, most men start building stories in their heads, trying to figure out what they did wrong. But the mistake usually isn't an action. It's the rushed interpretation of her silence, and this is exactly where things start slipping without him even realizing it. The average guy sees this distance and thinks he needs to fix something immediately. He goes back through conversations, trying to remember every detail, like there's a hidden mistake buried somewhere in the past. But there's an uncomfortable truth almost nobody talks about. The distance is not always about something he did wrong. Sometimes it's just her emotional space reorganizing itself, like a tide pulling back before shifting direction. And understanding this completely changes how he should respond. Because when he doesn't understand this moment, he goes into autopilot, anxiety, urgency, control attempts. And this is the point where he starts losing presence without even noticing it. He thinks he's fixing the situation, but in reality, he's just increasing emotional distance. And it's funny how her silence starts feeling louder, exactly when he tries to fill it too much. But what's really happening underneath goes way deeper than it looks. And that's where things go even further in the next point. Topic 2. Why most men instantly panic and chase. The emotional trap. The first instinct for most men when they feel her pulling away is not to think. It's to act, as if her silence is an emergency signal that demands an immediate response. He grabs his phone and starts sending messages one after another, trying to recover what feels like it's slipping away. Are you okay? You seem different. Did I do something wrong? Questions driven more by fear than clarity. And without realizing it, he slips into a state where he's no longer choosing. He's reacting. This doesn't happen because he's weak, but because of poorly managed emotional anxiety. The brain reads distance as loss, and loss creates urgency, like something needs to be fixed right now. And in that state, he starts giving up his natural posture without even noticing it. He over-explains, over-justifies, tries to be perfect, as if that could instantly restore the connection. But the effect is the opposite. The more he chases, the more she feels the shift in his energy. And here's a silent psychological trap most people miss. He thinks he's being proactive, but in reality, he's lowering his emotional presence. He moves from a grounded position into a needy one, and that changes the entire dynamic. Because need doesn't create attraction. It creates pressure, and pressure pushes her further away. And this is exactly where most men start losing something they don't fully understand yet. What's behind her distance goes much deeper. Topic 3. The hidden psychology behind her distance. When she starts pulling away, most men instantly assume it means she's losing interest. But behind this behavior, there's a much more subtle psychological layer happening. It's not always about leaving. Sometimes it's about reorganizing internal emotions she can't fully explain herself. In certain moments, the mind needs space to process feelings that became too confusing or too intense. And that distance can simply be a natural emotional regulation mechanism. There's also something else most people never consider. Attraction isn't static, it fluctuates. Sometimes it increases, sometimes it temporarily drops without meaning the relationship is over. It's like emotional breathing. Come closer, then pull back, then come closer again. And when a man doesn't understand this rhythm, he starts reacting like every pullback is permanent. But in relationship psychology, not every distance means rejection. Some are just internal pauses. The problem begins when he treats this space like a threat and tries to fill it immediately. Instead of allowing the natural process, he pushes for answers, clarity, or validation. And that breaks the emotional balance that was still forming quietly. The truth is, at this stage, she doesn't need more intensity. She needs stability around her. And it's exactly the lack of that stability that leads to the most critical mistakes, which show up in the next point. Topic 4. What you should never do when she pulls away. When she starts pulling away, there's a set of behaviors that feel natural, but actually make everything worse. The first mistake is trying to compensate distance with overpresence. Too many messages, too many calls, too many explanations. That doesn't bring her closer. It creates pressure, and pressure completely changes how he is perceived in that moment. What once felt light starts to feel heavy, like the connection is being forced. And the dangerous part is that he believes he's saving the situation, when he's actually accelerating the distance. Another common mistake is entering emotional self-defense mode, trying to prove value. He starts explaining behaviors, justifying past actions, or even changing who he is just to avoid losing her. But attraction doesn't come from desperate effort. It comes from stability and natural presence. When he adjusts too much, he loses his foundation, and that weakens perceived value. It's like he's silently saying, "I need to convince you to stay." And maybe the most silent mistake of all is abandoning his own emotional center. He stops focusing on his life, his goals, and puts all attention on that distance. This creates a dangerous inversion. She becomes the emotional center, and he becomes dependent on her response. And dependency never goes unnoticed. It completely shifts attraction dynamics. And this is exactly where the biggest turning point begins. What he should do instead changes everything in the next level. Topic 5. The masculine response that actually reverses attraction. There's a point where everything shifts, but it has nothing to do with chasing or over-explaining. In fact, the most powerful masculine response starts with something simple but difficult to maintain: emotional stability. He doesn't react impulsively, doesn't try to fix anything immediately, and doesn't turn her silence into a personal emergency. He understands his value isn't tied to response speed or temporary emotional intensity. And this quiet, grounded posture already starts shifting the energy without him saying much. The second part of this response is returning to his center. He goes back to his routine, his focus, his goals, the things that existed before anxiety took over. Not as a strategy to look unavailable, but as a real reconnection with his own life. Because nothing is more attractive than someone who doesn't lose themselves when external things change. And that creates a clear difference between reacting and staying grounded. And finally, there's strategic silence, not as punishment but as balance. He stops trying to fill spaces that aren't open right now and lets the natural rhythm of the situation unfold. This silence doesn't push her away. It restores emotional dignity and resets the dynamic. And interestingly, it's in this pressure-free space that attraction often starts reorganizing itself. But what happens next depends on how he holds this new state. And that leads to the next level. Topic 6. How to rebuild attraction without chasing. Once he gets back to his emotional center, the next step isn't chasing. It's rebuilding presence. But not a loud or anxious presence. A calm, steady, hard-to-ignore one. He doesn't try to restart the connection like something broken, because that would already shift the energy. Instead, he simply interacts naturally again, without carrying emotional weight in every message, and that alone starts changing how he's perceived. Rebuilding attraction happens in subtle details. A man who isn't desperate naturally sounds calmer even in simple words. He doesn't force long conversations, doesn't seek validation, and doesn't rush what needs time. That lack of urgency creates emotional space, and emotional space creates curiosity, something far more powerful than chasing. And that quiet curiosity is where the dynamic starts shifting again. But there's an even more important point: emotional consistency. He doesn't show up intense one day and disappear the next. He stays steady, like someone who isn't dependent on immediate reactions to feel secure. And that makes her notice something different. Not forced change, but rare emotional maturity. And when that perception grows, it naturally leads to one final internal shift that changes everything. Topic 7. When letting go becomes your strongest move. There comes a moment when a man realizes that over-pursuing isn't courage anymore. It's losing direction. And that's exactly when letting go stops being weakness and becomes the strongest move he can make. It's not about giving up out of pride, and not about pretending indifference. It's about stopping the fight against something he can't fully control. When he stops pushing, he finally sees the situation clearly. And that clarity completely changes how he shows up from that point on. Letting go doesn't mean absence of feeling. It means enough emotional control to not lose yourself trying to hold on to someone. He keeps living, keeps improving, keeps moving forward with direction, regardless of her response. And that creates a strange effect. What once felt distant starts being reevaluated from a different perspective. Because emotional stability is rare, and rarity always gets attention in some way. And there's a final truth here. Not every story is meant to be forced. Sometimes when a man stops chasing, he discovers two things at once. Either she comes back with a new perspective, or he finally realizes he needs to move on. In both cases, he regains something far more valuable than immediate answers: self-respect. And that state is what breaks emotional dependency and opens the door to something more mature. Now he's no longer reacting. He's living his own life with direction. Conclusion. Now you've seen the full pattern behind this situation, and why so many men make things worse right when they want to fix everything. It's not about brute emotional strength, and it's not about trying to recover something through panic. It's about internal control when everything outside feels uncertain. And the real question is simple. Do you react on autopilot, or do you learn to stay grounded even when it hits your emotions? Because the difference between those two states completely changes your relationships. One creates pressure, the other creates respect. If this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel. The goal here is simple: help men understand emotional dynamics, stop reacting out of anxiety, and build more control, clarity, and presence in relationships. And we're aiming for 1,000 subscribers, so if you want to be part of this kind of content and grow with this community, subscribe now and turn on notifications. It helps the channel grow and brings more videos like this to you.